If you are over 70 years old, or if you have elderly parents or grandparents who travel within the United States, what I am about to share with you could prevent a devastating situation at the airport. Starting in 2025 and extending into 2026, new federal identification requirements are being strictly enforced at airport security checkpoints across the country. And here is what many families do not realize until it is too late. Your elderly loved one could be stopped at TSA and denied boarding, even for a domestic flight, even if they have flown dozens of times before, simply because their identification no longer meets federal standards. This is not a rumor. This is not an exaggeration. This is federal law that has been delayed multiple times, but is now being implemented. And the consequences for those who are unprepared, especially elderly immigrants, naturalized citizens, and green card holders, can be severe and deeply distressing. Today, I am going to explain exactly what is changing, who is most at risk, and what steps you need to take right now to protect yourself and your family from being turned away at the gate. Let me start by explaining what this is actually about. For years, the federal government has been working toward implementing what is known as Real ID. This is a set of security standards for state-issued identification cards and driver's licenses that was originally mandated by the Real ID Act of 2005. The law was passed in response to the September 11th attacks and was designed to create a more secure and standardized form of identification for accessing federal facilities, including airport security checkpoints. The full enforcement of Real ID has been delayed multiple times, most recently due to the pandemic, but the deadline has now arrived. As of May 7, 2025, and continuing into 2026, every traveler attempting to board a domestic flight in the United States must present a Real ID-compliant identification card, or an acceptable alternative such as a valid U.S. passport or passport card. If your driver's license or state ID does not have the Real ID marking, which is typically a gold or black star in the upper corner of the card, it will no longer be accepted at TSA checkpoints for domestic air travel. This applies to everyone, regardless of age, citizenship status, or how many times you have flown before. Now, here is where this becomes critically important for elderly travelers and immigrant families. Many older Americans, particularly those over 70, have held the same driver's license or state ID for years. Some have stopped driving and allowed their licenses to expire. Others have identification cards that were issued before Real ID standards were implemented in their state. And a significant number of elderly immigrants, including green card holders and naturalized citizens, may have identification documents that do not meet the new federal requirements. The problem is that many of these individuals do not know their ID is no longer valid for air travel. They assume that because they have used it before, it will continue to work. But this is where families are being caught off guard. When enforcement began in 2025 and continues strictly into 2026, TSA agents are required to turn away anyone who does not present compliant identification. There are no exceptions based on age. There are no exceptions based on past travel history. If your ID does not meet the standard, you do not board the plane. Imagine this scenario. An elderly parent, perhaps someone who immigrated to the United States decades ago and became a citizen, arrives at the airport to fly across the country to visit grandchildren. They have their state ID, the same one they have used for years, but it does not have the Real ID star. They do not have a passport because they have not traveled internationally in years. At the security checkpoint, they are told they cannot proceed. The flight is missed. The family reunion does not happen, and the emotional toll on everyone involved is significant. This scenario is not hypothetical. It is happening at airports across the country right now, and it will continue to happen with increasing frequency as enforcement becomes stricter throughout 2026. But this is where many families make a critical mistake. They assume that obtaining a Real ID for an elderly relative is a simple process. In reality, for many older immigrants and naturalized citizens, it can be surprisingly complicated. To obtain a real ID-compliant driver's license or state ID, applicants must visit their state's Department of Motor Vehicles or equivalent agency in person. They must provide specific documentation proving their identity, social security number, and residency. The required documents typically include a birth certificate or valid passport, a social security card or document showing the full social security number, and 2 proofs of current residency, such as utility bills or bank statements. For naturalized citizens, a certificate of naturalization or a U.S. passport is required. For green card holders, the permanent resident card must be presented along with other supporting documents. Now, consider the challenges this presents for an elderly person. They may have difficulty locating original documents from decades ago. Birth certificates from other countries may need to be translated and verified. Naturalization certificates may be stored away and forgotten. Some elderly individuals have cognitive decline that makes navigating bureaucratic processes extremely difficult. Others have mobility issues that make an in-person DMV visit a significant challenge. And here is another complication that many families do not anticipate. Processing times for real ID applications have increased significantly as the deadline approached. In some states, applicants are waiting weeks or even months for appointments. If you wait until the last minute, you may not be able to obtain a compliant ID in time for a scheduled flight. This brings me to the question of alternatives. If obtaining a real ID is not immediately possible, what other documents can be used to board a domestic flight? The most reliable alternative is a valid U.S. passport or U.S. passport card. These documents are federally issued and meet all security requirements for domestic air travel. If your elderly relative has a current passport, they can continue to fly without any issues. However, many elderly individuals, particularly those who do not travel internationally, have let their passports expire or never obtained one in the first place. Renewing or obtaining a passport also takes time. Standard passport processing currently takes 6 to 8 weeks, though this can vary. Expedited processing is available for an additional fee but still requires several weeks. If an elderly relative needs to travel soon and does not have valid identification, time becomes a critical factor. For green card holders, the permanent resident card itself is accepted at TSA checkpoints. However, the card must be valid and unexpired. If a green card has expired, it will not be accepted, and the traveler may be denied boarding. This is another area where elderly permanent residents sometimes encounter problems, as they may not realize their card has expired or may have difficulty navigating the renewal process. Now, let me address a concern that I know many of you have. What happens if an elderly person arrives at the airport without proper identification? Is there any way they can still board their flight? TSA does have a process for verifying the identity of travelers who arrive without acceptable identification. This may involve additional screening, answering questions to verify identity, and the use of various databases to confirm who the person is. However, this process is not guaranteed to result in clearance. It takes additional time, which could cause a missed flight, and it can be extremely stressful for an elderly person who may not understand what is happening or why they are being detained at security. Relying on this backup process is not advisable. It should be considered a last resort, not a plan. The only reliable way to ensure smooth travel is to have proper identification before arriving at the airport. Let me now discuss who is most affected by these changes and why immigrant families need to pay particularly close attention. First, elderly naturalized citizens are at high risk. Many of these individuals became citizens decades ago and have not updated their identification documents to reflect current standards. They may have state IDs that were issued before real ID requirements existed in their state. They may not have passports because they have not traveled internationally since becoming citizens. And they may not be aware that the identification they have used successfully for years is about to become invalid for air travel. Second, elderly green card holders face unique challenges. Their permanent resident cards must be valid and unexpired. But green card renewal is a lengthy process that can take many months. If an elderly permanent residence card expires and they need to travel, they may find themselves unable to board a domestic flight until their renewal is processed. Third, elderly individuals with cognitive decline or limited English proficiency are particularly vulnerable. They may not understand the new requirements. They may not be able to navigate the process of obtaining a real ID on their own. And they may become extremely distressed if they are stopped at airport security and denied boarding. The responsibility for ensuring elderly relatives are prepared often falls on adult children and other family members. But many families are not aware of these requirements until a problem occurs. So what should you do right now to protect yourself and your elderly loved ones? First, check the identification of every elderly family member who may travel by air. Look at their driver's license or state ID. Is there a gold or black star in the upper corner? If not, the ID is not real ID compliant and will not be accepted at TSA checkpoints for domestic flights starting from the enforcement date. Second, check whether they have a valid U.S. passport. If they do, this solves the problem immediately. A passport is accepted for domestic travel and does not require any additional action. If their passport is expired, consider renewing it as soon as possible. Third, if they need a real ID, start the process now. Gather the required documents. Make an appointment at the DMV. Do not wait until a flight is already booked. Processing times can be unpredictable, and you do not want to be in a situation where travel plans must be canceled because identification is not ready. Fourth, for green card holders, verify that the permanent resident card is current. If it is expired or approaching expiration, begin the renewal process immediately. USCIS processing times for green card renewals can be lengthy, so early action is essential. Fifth, have a conversation with elderly relatives about these requirements. Make sure they understand that the rules have changed. Make sure they know not to arrive at the airport with an outdated ID expecting to fly as they always have. This conversation could prevent significant distress and disruption later. Let me be clear about something important. I am not providing legal advice in this video. Immigration and identification requirements can be complex, and individual circumstances vary. If you have specific questions about documentation for a naturalized citizen, a green card holder, or any other immigration-related matter, you should consult with a qualified immigration attorney or contact the appropriate government agency directly. What I am providing is awareness. I want you to understand that these changes are real, they are being enforced, and they have the potential to cause serious problems for unprepared families. The time to act is now, not when you are standing at the TSA checkpoint watching your elderly mother or father being told they cannot board their flight. The emotional impact of being denied boarding can be significant, especially for elderly individuals. It can cause confusion, fear, and a sense of helplessness. For families who have planned reunions, medical trips, or other important travel, a denied boarding can disrupt everything. And in some cases, the stress of such an experience can have lasting effects on an elderly person's willingness to travel at all. This is preventable. With proper preparation and timely action, every elderly traveler can have the documentation they need to fly without incident. Let me summarize the key points you need to remember from this video. First, starting from May 2025 and strictly enforced through 2026, standard driver's licenses and state IDs without the real ID marking will not be accepted for domestic air travel. This applies to all travelers, including those over 70. Second, acceptable alternatives include a real ID compliant license, a valid U.S. passport or passport card, or for permanent residence, a valid unexpired green card. Third, obtaining a real ID or renewing a passport takes time. If you have elderly relatives who may need to fly, check their documents now and begin any necessary application processes immediately. Fourth, have a direct conversation with elderly family members about these requirements. Do not assume they are aware of the changes or that they will be able to navigate the process alone. If this information was helpful to you, please consider subscribing to this channel. We provide timely updates on immigration policies, travel requirements, and other issues that affect immigrant families, students, and professionals in the United States. Staying informed is one of the most important things you can do to protect yourself and your loved ones. In an upcoming video, we will discuss what to do if your elderly relative's green card is expired and they need to travel urgently, including the options available and the steps to take. Make sure you do not miss that. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay prepared, and I will see you in the next one.